O my people, your leaders are misleaders. They have confused the course of your paths. I don't know about you, but when I first heard this verse, I stopped dead in my tracks and missed the entire rest of that morning's scripture readings. I couldn't help but think of the prophet Isaiah's words being applicable to the current state of affairs in this country. Granted, taking a verse out of context can result in gross misinterpretation and misapplication of the text. In this case, however, commentaries on this verse sound something like tabloid headlines: judgment against Judah's leaders, and unworthy leaders in a society in ruins. News at 11. Reading prophetic text can be challenging on a number of levels. Like Isaiah, interpretation can be difficult and complex. Passages often don't follow in chronological order, and honestly, the words can make one squirm in discomfort. We hear phrases like, "Woe unto you," and "I have seen your abominations," and even that God is watching. It's enough to make a person paranoid. And all those issues about obedience, obedience, obedience. Now, it's a natural thing to attempt to interpret biblical literature, to find ways in which we can apply the message to our own times and circumstances. This can be true whether we are looking for ways to explain national or local events, help solve problems, find ways to manage a crisis or personal tragedy, or enhance our own spirituality and relationship with God. Sometimes our interpretations veer far away from the original meaning of the words. There are those times, however, when connections can be made directly applicable without stretching our imaginations too far. You may or may not agree with me, but my intuition tells me these words of Isaiah seem to be one of those instances where we can relate to and apply the prophet's words. While I try to open my heart to ways in which biblical passages speak to me, I also like to go a bit further. Even though this oracle of Isaiah appears to be a very simple case of comparing ancient apples to modern-day apples, I found it helpful to do some research. I wanted to learn something about the historical circumstances, what Isaiah's mission was, why he was saying what he was saying, and as well as his intended audience. There are many ways of going about the task of exploring those kinds of questions. It could be reading the commentaries in the Bible, although I once heard a sermon in which the preacher said the meaning is not in the commentaries. Well, while this can be true, biblical commentaries can also be very helpful. Other ways of learning about biblical literature could be taking a class. It could be asking one's pastor. It could be going online. But one caution about that last one, however, while going online can provide a goldmine of valuable information, it can also be a minefield of questionable accuracy. One way that's interesting and informative is through what is called midrash. And when I first heard that term, my question was, what's that? A good description of midrash is that it's an interpretive act, seeking the answers to religious questions, both practical and theological, by plumbing the meaning of the words of Torah, the meaning, the law of God given to Moses in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, as well as throughout the Bible. Now, where midrash can be especially worthwhile to the seeker is that it responds to contemporary problems and crafts new stories. Therefore, midrash can help us to find ways of practically applying Scripture to our day-to-day lives. As with all of the prophets, social injustice was a major theme in which God's message was unambiguous. It did not matter how often you prayed. performed rituals and rites. If your comfortable lifestyle and seeking more and more riches and stuff without taking care of widows, orphans, those who are sick, poor, and in need, then you are living an unrighteous life. This is often misunderstood as just needing to be a good person who's never sought to hurt anyone. This is what is referred to by the eminent biblical scholar, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, as the evil of indifference. Now, this indifference about which Heschel speaks is a common trait of humanity. So how can this indifference happen? Well, it can be a combination of preoccupation with our own needs, interests, plans, and goals. It can be due to lives packed so full of other things that we do not have the physical or emotional energy left for anything else. It can be due to misunderstanding that the needs of the poor, those who are homeless, experiencing oppression and discrimination, do not directly affect our lives. The mission of God's prophets goes beyond social change. God calls for social action. The type of social action called for by Isaiah and other prophets will result in radical transformation of the social and political order. Now, that can be a very scary thing to contemplate, let alone to engage in. Not only have we as individuals and a nation put our collective arms around and fully embraced popular Western culture, our leaders and even some of our churches have done the same. We have preachers in the pulpit and on TV who profess the sign of God's favor to be financial prosperity. That is not, and never has been, the sign of God's endorsement. It can be very hard to recognize how our own lifestyle can oppress others. Isaiah's message speaks directly to the popularization by leaders in government and industry of how the pursuit of the accumulation of wealth and power is not God's way. It becomes increasingly evident that we are being led down the wrong path and confused by the wrong rhetoric and bombast. Although Isaiah's words, as found in chapter 3, verse 12, were meant for the leaders, elite class, as well as ordinary people of the late 8th century BCE, they are every bit as applicable to our times. During Isaiah's age, and before, increasing power was being sought by the kings of Israel and Judah, accumulation of wealth to the detriment of social programs, oppression of the poor through taxes and usury, amassing large armies, as well as huge building projects for the glorification of the kingdom, was common practice. Sound familiar? It is what the late University of Michigan biblical scholar George Mendenhall characterized as the paganization of Israel. That lifestyle resulted in oppressive social policies that wound up lining the pockets of the already affluent during the period of the prophets. Again, I must ask, does this sound familiar? This is what has been referred to as the royal consciousness, which was applicable then as well as now. At the heart of the prophetic message is God's love for us. Isaiah does not ask us to upend our political system. What we need is transformation of those who are our leaders. Now, although Isaiah was speaking of the rulers, false prophets, priests, and the elite class of his society as the leaders, I have taken that term leaders further. For me, a great many of us are leaders, whether as coaches, counselors, teachers, committee members, parents. All of us can also be misleaders, consciously or often unconsciously, steering others down confused paths. In his book, The Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann observes, we also are children of the royal consciousness, that all of us have deep commitments to it. Even more powerful than those observations, he asks a prophetic question of his own. Can we imagine something different? In order to do this, we need to ask if our consciousness and imagination have been so assaulted and co-opted by the royal consciousness that we have been robbed of the courage or power to think an alternative thought. It is Brueggemann's belief that questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. And speaking for my own parish, it is made up of good people. Every Christmastide, we have what is called an ingathering, in which we provide new clothing, toys, and gifts to the local community center for those deeply in need. We have a mitten tree and large baskets always out for donated clothing. We collect toiletries, such as foot powder, deodorant, toothpaste, and brushes, and other items prohibitively expensive for many people. We just completed our annual food drive for food gatherers, in which $22,000 worth of food and monetary donations were given by our parishioners. These offerings will provide 15,000 meals to local residents. We volunteer for Habitat for Humanity. Our parish also runs a free breakfast program 365 days a year and have been doing so for almost 35 years. We also are one of the host churches for opening our doors for a week to homeless men from the local shelter to spend the night. It is staffed by parishioners who volunteer their time to also stay the night. It seems as though our church does so much. We also have many parishioners who are politically active by attending marches, volunteering at women's centers, meeting with and or writing to politicians, etc. We have also had forums based on reading books about the abominable realities of living in our society as a person of color, of being poor, of being gay, of being a prisoner, of being an immigrant, about the discrimination in its many ugly forms. But despite all of this, Isaiah pricks my conscience into asking, is that enough? Does our parish do all it can? Can each of us say we have done our part in fulfilling the prophet's message? Have we done enough toward fulfilling God's mission in this broken world of ours? My answer is, I don't know. However, my spiritual unease makes me think it is not enough, and we should not feel self-satisfied or rest on our laurels. In this day and age, many of us have been so beaten down on a daily basis by the increasing rhetoric and violence of racism, bigotry, and just plain evil, as well as by so much need that we don't even want to listen to the news any longer, let alone to a prophetic sermon. It's just too much. After all, what can we do? It feels as though we are on a runaway train. To protect our emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being, do we need to become numb and full of ennui to this onslaught? Have we ever been, as the people that are a shining city on the hill? Now, this has been an awful lot of gloom and doom I've laid before you today. However, there is one very important takeaway I want to leave with you regarding the prophetic message. That is, God's message has been and always will be one that ends in hope, forgiveness, and in love for us. I would like to leave you with the words I found personally inspiring. It comes from a sermon by Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt in which she shares the words of Rabbi Heschel, that prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and to ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, oppression, and falsehood. The liturgical movement must become a revolutionary movement, seeking to overthrow the forces that continue to destroy the promise, the hope, and the vision. So I ask, can we, as individual leaders, imagine something different? Amen.